First off, I want to thank everybody for being here. It's very, very hard to get a group of people together to talk about debt because we've been told since time immemorial that if we're in debt, we've done something wrong, that we should feel ashamed, that we're guilty of something. And so one of the first moves of organizing is, how do you get people to come out of the debtor's closet? How do you get people to come out in public? How do you get people to gather together to talk about the debts that we owe? Because if we can't come together, we don't have that collective power that we need. And so this is part of the process of trying to get people to come out and talk about their debts and not feel 1 ounce of shame, guilt, or anything other negative about it. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but I also want to acknowledge something that Jacques said in the beginning about the time period that we're living in, the moment that we're living in. And I want to say that a lot of police brutality is caused because of debt. That there are things, and I'm going to use the chat on occasion, called fine farming. So there's cities that owe debts, and cities like Ferguson, and what do? Cities like Ferguson, this is in a DOJ report, say, we're gonna collect money to pay our debts by giving tickets to Black people. And if they can't pay them, we're gonna lock them up. That's fucked up. People should be mad about that. Police officers kill and maim innocent people, and then cities take out loans to pay off the victims. So the cities go further into debt. There's a whole cycle of racial violence, police violence that's tied up with debt. And we need to acknowledge that. The people on the streets are in the streets fighting against this entire system that we're talking about today, for racial justice and for a better life that doesn't involve some of these burdens that people disproportionately, historically marginalized populations have to carry. So there's 2 main things in this short intervention that I want to try and get across. And I'm going to use notes, otherwise I'll just start rambling. Nobody wants that. But there's 2 main things that I want to really get across. Number 1, why are we in so much damn debt? Number 2, why we aren't at fault at all for being in the debt. So why are we in so much damn debt? And why we're not at fault, why we didn't do anything wrong, and why we shouldn't feel any guilt about having the debts that we have. And I want to start off with the latter, actually, with that second point, just by talking about a personal anecdote about my debt. And it's actually, I think I listed in the chat, I have $200,000 in student loans, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about a different type of debt, actually, for a second. And I want to talk about my father, who was a teacher, worked for 35 years south side of Chicago, did a lot of good work for people. But you know, as a teacher, you don't make much money, right? And like a lot of people in this country, he didn't have health insurance, or he had shitty health insurance. And so one day I get a call, he's got cancer and he's in the hospital. And I go and I see him, and he's, you know, in terrible shape. And they say he's got a week to live. And then they say, how are you gonna pay for this? And me and my brother and sister, we say, we don't know. And they're like, all right, well then he can stay here for 5 days. Then you gotta move him. Like, what do you mean we gotta move him? The guy's got cancer, he can't even move. He's dying. They're like, sorry, you gotta move him. So we move him once, same story. How are you gonna pay for this? What are you gonna do with him? We don't know. He doesn't have insurance, not gonna cover it. All right, well, he's got 5 days. He outlives that 5 days too. Move him again, same thing. Ends up in excuse my French, but some shithole place, don't even have drugs to keep the pain down. He spends the last hours of his life looking at a clock. And I say, Dad, why are you looking at a clock? He says, because I got to live one more day, 2 more days, so I can collect more pension. Because I'm going to leave you guys in massive debt. And I can't do that. And I told him, man, fuck that. You did the best you could with what you had. Thank you. And I want to bring up that story because I want to make a point right from the beginning to say not one of us should ask for debt forgiveness. We didn't do anything wrong. We should ask for debt abolition. Cancel that shit. We didn't do it. All we wanted was an education. We want to put food on the table of the people we care about. We want a good house. We want to live a decent life. No one should feel guilty about that. I'm not asking for forgiveness for anything. I'm asking for abolition. I'm telling them to cancel this stuff. And I also want to say one more thing to the banks that took everything we owned after my dad died. Our house, they wouldn't let us go back in there. They took everything we owned. I want to say this right now. I am definitely coming for you. So, how did we get into this mess? How is it that so many people that are just trying to live a decent life are getting destroyed by debts? And there's a lot to say about this, so I'm going to keep it short, and then hopefully we can unpack some of this in a conversation. But the first thing we need to recognize, and I know a lot of us here are here to talk about student debt, the first thing we need to recognize is that there was a point in this country, particularly after World War II, where education, higher education, was basically free. That all these people that like to say, what are you complaining about? A lot of these same people got to go to college for free. And or you could work like a summer part-time job and pay for basically everything. And we need to remember that. There is a moment, though, and this is where things get a little complicated, where there are different ideas that start to take hold in our society, and these ideas have massive consequences on the way that our society is organized. And the easiest way to talk about this is to use a term. I'm going to share my screen here just for a second. The term is neoliberalism, and I'm going to just talk a little bit about that. But basically, long story short, 1970s, 1980s, you get this idea of neoliberalism. It's an ideology, it's a system of thought, and it has different principles. And some of the principles that it has lead to different policies and consequences. So for example, one of the principles is privatize as much as possible. Gut public goods. Gut public healthcare, gut public education, make everything either be private or make the individual pay for everything. And we'll talk about that in a second. The other thing is that the neoliberals, those are the people that believe and push neoliberalism, say that we constantly have to be in competition against each other. Survival of the fittest, compete for the small resources that exist. And that drives us apart. That keeps us separate from one another because we're all fighting for this small piece of the pie while the 1% keeps accumulating as much as possible. And that makes it really hard to resist because we're just trying to get by. And we got to compete against each other just to get by. So that's another key part that really hurts us. There's deregulation. They try and get the government, public services out of everything. They say that everyone's on their own, that no one should monitor the markets. Let the banks do whatever they want. Let the banks have all the power. Let the banks and let the financiers and all the 1%, let them dictate how society should run. Don't let the government intervene and tell them what they can and can't do. And that has consequences on all of us. And so one of the things about debt is that debt intensifies all this. It makes us more competitive. It makes us more vulnerable. It makes it harder for us to come together. I always got to be working on myself to pay my debts. I always got to be spending every single goddamn hour I have worrying about my debts and doing work on myself or work outside my house trying to figure out how to pay that debt. And I'm sorry, I just noticed there's a little guy here. I should stop using bad words. My apologies. So this is part of the problem, that the debts are driving us apart. The debts are always making us work, and the debts are making us be controlled by the banks and the 1%. So one of the key things that happened, and I do want to show a couple slides here, and this is really important for understanding how we got in this mess. Okay, so there's a shift, and this is important for understanding why we got into the place we did with student loan debt. In the neoliberal era, we've moved, and this is a guy named Wolfgang Streeck, we've moved from what we can call a tax state to a debt state. And I'm talking about the country here, but this also works on local levels. And so let me just explain that what that means. There were periods of US history, albeit problematic, but there were periods of US history where a lot of public goods like education was paid for through taxes. But what happens in the neoliberal era, remember I talked about the 1%, is that we start giving tax breaks to the 1% into corporations. And once we start giving tax breaks to the 1% in corporations, that means that there's less money coming into the system. So there's less money for public higher education. There's less money for other services that we all need. And so everything, including our lives, becomes dependent on debt. That the only way to pay for education is through debt. States go into debt. Municipalities go into debt. We individuals go into debt. And so debt financing becomes the way in which operations run. So there's a myth out there, and I want to be really careful about that. It's not high spending that's the reason for a lot of our problems. It's the fact that there's not enough revenue coming into the system. And because there's not enough revenue coming into the system, it means that public goods aren't funded properly. And there's not enough revenue coming in because of these tax breaks that corporations and individuals get. Now, it's really important to say, and this is really clear in places like California, that these tax breaks come after organized tax revolts. And what you get is basically a lot of upper class white folks who pressure politicians to cut their taxes. And one of the things they say is, we don't want to pay for more poor black and brown people to go to higher education for free. We don't want our tax dollars going to those people of color to study in public university. And they win their fight. It's a racialized fight against taxes that they win. And that has an enormous impact on all the new generations of students that enter the public university from the 1970s onward, up until today. And so up until today, there's not enough funding to drive tuition costs down, to make college free, which is as it should be. And so what do you get there is you get a problem that happens. We see here that this is the student debt crisis right now. And this is just one example of how this whole shift from the tax state to the debt state works. But as we can see that there's an enormous climb or rise in student debt. So from 2003 up until 2018, there's this, you can see it's at like, what is that, 3 billion or I'm sorry, yeah, around 3 billion all the way up into 1.5 trillion. Today we're at 1.6 trillion dollars total debt. The other thing to keep in mind about this, and I want to be clear about this, do not think for a second that the Republicans are our only enemies. The Democrats are also not our friends. You can see here that this debt increase is occurring in both Republican and Democratic administrations, because both the Republicans and the Democrats abide by this neoliberal ideology that we talked about. They're not interested in serving the public. They're not interested in paying public goods or giving public goods what they need. And so that creates a huge problem. And so what happened? This is after the last recession. This is 2008. And what you can see here is state funding for higher education. The numbers in red are all the cuts to higher education. So Arizona cut its funding to higher education by 55%. Where I live in Pennsylvania cut its funding by 34%. This is after 2008. Very few states made any type of increase in blue, and I can share these slides later. So this is important. On the one hand, keep this in mind. On the one hand, the states are cutting funding for public higher education after the recession. At the same time, that tuition is going crazy. So remember, the red is the increase here in tuition. So Louisiana raised tuition from 2008 to 2018 by 105%. Arizona, remember, they cut their state funding for education by 55%. Tuition rises in Arizona by 92%. And this is where the student debt comes in, because if you had a drastic cut in state funding, meaning that the universities don't have the funding they need, and then they decide the only way to keep the university open is by charging students, what do? They jack up tuition. So you have less funding coming in, you have tuition going up, and guess what? The only way you can get your foot in the door of the university is by taking on loans, because they're so damn expensive now and because there's no public funding for them. And so this terrible situation that is not natural, that is caused by politicians, that is made by political decisions. If the politicians wanted to, they could fund higher education more. They could then have free tuition. That's not the case. What's actually happened is what we just said, is that you've had cuts in state funding, a rise in tuition, and the only way that anyone goes to study now is by taking on loans. This has enormously, a tremendous impact on women and on people of color. So it is more than accurate to say that debt is a gender and a race issue. And this is a study from the American Association of University Women. But remember, there's $1.6 trillion in student debt. 930 billion of that is held by women. In other words, of the $1.6 trillion of student debt, 66% is held by women. As they say here, women graduate owing almost $22,000 in student debt. It's actually a little bit higher than this compared to men. So women owe more than men. And Black women graduate with an average debt of close to $38,000. So this is a racialized issue again. It's a gender issue, it's a racialized issue. To make matters worse is that because of the gender pay gap, if you graduate with more debt, it takes you longer to pay that debt back because you're not getting paid equally. So it's like a double whammy. And this is what this line here says, that women take about 2 years longer than men to repay student loans, more likely to struggle economically as they do. One bullet that's not in here that I wanted to say is that 55% of African-American women who are paying their student loans right now are having trouble meeting basic needs for food, healthcare, or housing. And again, the more than 70% of Black students go into debt to pay for higher education compared to 56% for whites. And so we see these racial discrepancies, we see the gender discrepancies that we, as organizers, we have to be attuned to. We have to be able to address these things as we're organized. And we have to figure out ways to talk about these things as we're organized. So I want to just end then and open this up and hopefully have some time for questioning. We're going to show you a video from one of our colleagues, Jalil Bishop, who's doing work with the Pennsylvania Debt Collective, and he's doing studies on the ways that student debt impacts Black students and Black graduates. And so we're going to show you a quick video that he made. But I just want to end by saying again, the only way we can take back what's rightfully ours is by collectively organizing. And we need to remember that they owe us and we don't owe them a damn thing. The next two sessions are going to get into a little bit more specifics about the student debt crisis and what we can do about it. So strategies to fight back. So again, this was just an overview to like get a general idea of how this is working, why it's working, get to know each other. And then the next couple sessions are going to be about like, so what do we do and how do we do it and where can we do it? And so if you also know other people that are interested in joining the call, I would say this would be really, have them join as well. But I just want to open it up for questions, and maybe a way to do this is if you want to ask a question, just type your name in the stack like that in the chat, and then I can say, okay, so Veronica or Andy or Felicia. So yeah, if anyone has any questions or you want to make comments too, that's more that you can make comments as well.
I was curious when you were talking about the lack of taxing of like taxes to pay for school. Is the solution just to increase taxes? Like what's the deal there? Like the solution? Is it just taxing the rich more?
Right. So it's a really good question. One of the things we need to be aware of is there's a difference between progressive taxation versus regressive taxation. Progressive taxation would tax the wealthy. Regressive taxes all of us. We're not interested in being taxed anymore. That's not what this is about. This is like Wall Street paying up. This is like Jeff Bezos paying up. This is like the billionaires paying up and making public education available to everyone. So in the College for All campaign, for example, the idea there was that the money to pay for free tuition for every single person in this country would come off of taxes on Wall Street transactions, not come off of taxes for us, the people, the working people. So thank you for that clarification. So this is really important. We're talking about the taxation on the wealth of the wealthiest. We're not interested in having poor people pay any cent more for any public goods. One of our colleagues, Hannah Appel, makes a distinction that I want to stress just for a second. That people that are going into debt to pay for basic necessities like food or gas in the car to get to work, keep the electric bill on, that's household debt. That helps your household like stay afloat. That's not consumer debt. It's not like we're all going out and buying like fancy shit and whatever. Like we're talking about like people are in debt because wages are stagnant, people are unemployed. You know, we're at an unemployment rate right now that's higher than ever besides the Great Depression. And when we were employed, we weren't making enough money to pay our bills because the powers that be have held down wages. So this is all, yeah, shit, Jobs is right. So this is all being amplified right now during the crisis. And you're exactly right. People are going to have to take on more household debt just to survive. So a lot of the things that the Debt Collective is working on is trying to say, not only do we need to be striking against student debt, but we also need to be striking against rent. We need to be striking and making sure that no one gets their utilities shut off. We need to be striking against people or for people that don't have enough money to get food on the table, to feed their kids. These are all these things that I think are, as you mentioned, going to be intensified over the period of this crisis. And so in a way, we've never been more vulnerable. But on the other side of that, we've never had a better opportunity to bring debtors together. People want to talk about debt right now because they're living debt, because they are going to face foreclosure, because we know how difficult times are going to be. So this is a perfect time to talk to people about debt. Sanders.
Like what would the future look like as far as like funding? You know, I liked the Education for All plan, but do we, you know, get rid of Pell Grants and go back to direct federal funding using Wall Street for that funding, ideally? You know, like what's kind of like the ideal scenario? And do we get rid of the GI Bill so that's not incentive for people to go off to war?
Absolutely. And, you know, that argument about just join the military, we know that hurts poor people the most, right? That can't pay. And so we send our poor people off to die and get maimed just so that they can then, you know, study. But I want to just really quickly, we're pushing for universal debt cancellation, which means everyone's debt should be canceled. And this is important because we don't want to get involved in this thing of like, well, you're deserving to have your debt canceled, but you're not. Like, we want to avoid that. We want to say, no, everyone deserves to have their debt canceled. We're not going to get into this game of like, some people deserve it and other people don't, because that's going to split us up. It's going to weaken us. It's going to divide us. Right, exactly. So Jubilee for everyone. The other thing is, you know, this idea of what would the ideal be? I mean, one idea that's been floated and that's being talked about right now is you have free tuition, you have debt cancellation, and you have an increase in per student spending. Because a lot of students, even if they get free tuition, are still going to need money to survive and live in places like, say, California or, you know, wherever, New York, and you name it. And that's also really hard. We're the richest country in the world. We can spend money on giving people the time to study and not having to work and do other things. So I think these are things that are going to come up in the next couple of sessions. I also think the idea of starting like a running folder that we can all share about resources would be super helpful. And we can set that up, and then it'd be great if people on this chat, or not this chat, on this Zoom could start contributing to those resources. The last thing I want to say is I actually want to give everyone a little bit of homework. I'm sorry, but this isn't that hard, but I do want to just leave you with one piece of homework. So we need a name, the Debt Collective now, I'm speaking nationally, we need a name for our campaign. This campaign to abolish debt across all levels of education. Like, what do we call this? Like, what should we call this thing? Like, what are we going to call this movement to abolish debt, to cancel debt across all levels, K through 12, for, you know, schools, for universities, for all students? What do we call this thing? And we need something catchy, right? Something that's going to catch online, we can tweet, whatever. But we don't know what to call this thing. So I would ask, yeah, and it also helps us, right, bring in.
No. Sorry, I'm actually, Jason and I live together, so I can't go off mute, otherwise we'll get like a screeching sound. But the issue we're having is that like there are like some catchy titles like cancel student debt. That the problem we're facing is that we want like cancel student debt, but also think about the proper funding of education. The questions you're asking, Sanders. So the struggle is like, what's a catchy, like, you know, hashtag campaign name that captures both, yeah, like abolishing all the debt, canceling all the debt, and providing proper funding for like free or, you know, federally funded education.
Thank you. So you got to work together. And when you're broke, you live together. But no, so seriously, if you can help us come up with the title, the name for this campaign, that would be amazing. So give that some thought, send us emails or get in touch with us, and definitely bring it to the next session. And if no one else has anything else to say, it's been a pleasure getting to meet you and to begin this conversation. Thank you so much to everyone. and stay strong out there, stay safe, and
Thank you.
there's hope. So let's fight.